Hey, George, how you doing? I know you're doing okay.
Thanks.
At the beginning of 1988, George Harrison was riding high. His single Got My Mind Set on You was released in October of 1987. He was on the cover of the Rolling Stone, October of 1987. January 16th, 1988, Got My Mind Set on You hit number 1 in the States. And January 20th, 1988, he gave that wonderful speech when the Beatles were inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And a few days after that, When We Was Fab was released. And after that, and going through February and March, he gave a lot of wonderful interviews promoting his album Cloud 9, and Cloud 9 would eventually hit platinum in the States. But the interview I want to talk about today is the one where George sits down with Bob Coburn of the radio station 95.5 KLOS in LA. Now, Bob has this regular spot called Rockline where he interviews artists, and George is his guest today, February 10th, 1988. And George is going to sit down and answer questions from folks who call into the radio show.
Hello, everybody.
And it's one of the best interviews out there to ever exist. And I'm just going to go over some of the highlights because I think it's so great. Now, George, he's normally nervous. This is not normally his cup of tea, but he does pretty good. And there he is sitting down talking to Bob. And Jeff Lynne is with him. Now, keep in mind, Jeff was working with him on the Cloud 9 album.
Well, actually, Jeff and I were born as Siamese twins.
And a couple of the first callers there were asking George what was it like to work with Jeff. And it all starts out with George being, a little bit jokey and saying that, that Jeff was just awful. He was absolutely just a rat. And he says, no, I'm just joking. I'm just joking. And then the caller hangs up and George says, piss off to the caller. And once again has to clarify, say, I was just joking. Maybe it has something to do with a couple of Dos Equis I had previous to going on the show today. So again, we're setting the tone here for the entire interview.
I had a Dos Equis earlier. That's all it is. Okay. Love you, Kenny. Love you.
But truly, George actually winds up being pretty patient and nice and polite to all of the callers after this. And he says that he's kind of getting used to doing this kind of thing, promoting his record, and it's fine. And he's feeling the love from everybody, not for the Beatles, and the love for himself. And he does start to get kind of comfy and cozy as time goes on. And he's zooming through all the calls like boom, boom, boom like this. And he says, hey, I'm starting to feel a little bit like Dr. Ruth here. So it's okay if you have any sexual problems, go ahead and let's talk about them. Like I'm saying, he set the tone. He's being very jokey. And at this point, he's talking about Ringo a little bit, and he's also talking about the Beatles.
I was the quiet Beatle.
And then someone asked him, hey, was that really Paul in your When We Was Fab video? Was that Paul in the walrus suit? And then George says, I do have a clue for you all. The walrus was Paul. And, it was just Paul's just being a little bit shy lately. But, I'm just not going to take George seriously here when it comes to this. I don't think so. A lot of people are complimenting George on his album Cloud 9 and saying they really love it. And hey, are you going to go on tour? And George says, I'm just really not looking forward to going touring.
Don't be surprised if you see me in your hometown this Saturday.
But, he and Paul or Ringo are working on this project, The Long and Winding Road. And he says that, Yoko is working on her own version of A Long and Winding Road. And he says it's probably going to come out before their, the Beatles' Long and Winding Road. And I think he's talking about the Imagine movie that came out in 1988.
I mean, this road is so long and so winding, you wouldn't believe it.
Then there's a caller who tells George that he named his son Harrison after him. And George jokes around and says,
I'm calling my next boy Dylan.
Then there's a caller who gets a little bit deep, talks about life. What is George's philosophy? Where can I find the answers? And George says, all you got to do is look inside your heart. It's all there. And he says that anything that you find in there, give it all away and everyone's going to give it all back to you.
Said the Joker to the thief.
Basically, the love that you take is equal to the love you make. During this whole interview, you can hear George playing this old Gretsch that someone in the studio gave him to play. Jeff Lynne has a guitar too, but you don't hear a whole lot from Jeff. But once in a while, he laughs at George's jokes. Then there's this one caller who asked George about his slide playing. And that prompts George to say, hey, here's a revelation for all you Beatle pickers out there. It wasn't me playing the slide on Baby You Can Drive My Car. He says, I was playing the lick, and it was Paul who overdubbed the slide part. And then he goes on to talk about his slide playing, and he's being very talkative and very chatty about it, and also very self-deprecating. And then he's asked about, hey, do you have anything on the drawing board? And he says, I have a lot of things kind of laying around, some good, some that need work, and some need chucking. But maybe they can make more money if I leave them as demos and sell them as bootlegs. Those bootlegs really stick in George's craw. Then he says he wants to do not a solo album, but maybe an album with some of his mates. And he says,
this is this new group I got. It's called the Traveling Wilburys.
He says they can go ahead and make an album, as a group, and then they can go on and make their own albums after that. But then the host interrupts him, and the subject is absolutely dropped after that. And then he gets on the subject of Handmade Films, and he talks about some of the upcoming projects. And then he tells a story about the time that he had to give the okay to a director to use one of John's songs, the song Mother, in one of the movies. And he says he really didn't like the idea of it. There was a few reasons. One of them was because, the song kind of brought up some bad feelings. He didn't really like it because he remembers at that point in time, like he was in one studio at Abbey Road singing My Sweet Lord, and here's John in the other studio singing I Don't Believe in This and I Don't Believe in That, kind of like the dream is over. And he says that we were really at extremes with each other. He just didn't bring up any good memories. He just really didn't like the thought of it. But he didn't want to deny the director, and if this is what the director wanted, he'd want to be that guy and say no to what this director wanted, like his vision. But he also didn't want to be that guy to go to Paul and Ringo and Yoko and ask to use a Beatle record in a movie.
The last thing I want to do is appear to be, using the Beatles or my past or anything.
Something else he doesn't like to do. So he was kind of in a lose-lose situation. He said they gave the okay to use the song anyway, and it turned out just fine. But he kept on going on and on about this subject, and eventually he was interrupted for a station break. And I bet he kind of probably went on and on during the station break, and we just didn't get to hear it. Then he starts talking about guitars again. He talks about the Gretsch that he's holding on the cover of Cloud 9. Says he got it from a sailor in Liverpool for about $200. He says then he got a Fender. He said he used it on Nowhere Man. And he said it went psychedelic in 1967, and now he uses it for his slide playing. And then someone asked him about memorabilia. Hey, you're still holding on to some of your Beatles stuff.
In fact, in the new video, I got my old Sgt. Pepper suit on, but I'm busting out of there all over.
And then they say, hey, do you listen to any of the old Beatle records? And then his quote is, I don't sit around home playing them much, but occasionally when I'm trying to listen to my latest single on the radio, I keep hearing Paul McCartney singing Michelle. And that's a quote. And then someone asked George about the concert for Bangladesh, and he goes on to tell a story about that, how all that happened, how it was just kind of this small project. And initially it included Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers was going to be part of the project, and maybe, they were going to try to raise maybe about $25,000. But he says once he got more involved with it, it got bigger. And here's the other quote that he says. He says, and I, from my Beatle training, which was mainly like John Lennon's kind of attitude, which is, if you're going to do it, let's just do it. Let's get Bob Dylan and everybody and just, make more than the $25,000.
And so that's what happened.
And then the next caller, I think, was she was my favorite caller on the whole program. They say hi, and he says, I'm all calmed down now, and it's been just really nice talking to everybody. And then she says, hey, George, it seems like you've been itching to play that guitar. Why don't you play something for us?
Okay, it goes like this. See, it doesn't really go like that, but I promised the guy who lent me the guitar that, I'd play it so that I could keep the guitar later.
And then George starts playing something, and he starts talking and he's strumming and he's waxing poetic about being out of tune, the guitar out of tune, and like he's out of tune and everybody's out of tune. And then he launches into like, Here Comes the Sun. But then once he starts singing and playing, someone, I guess in the studio or something, turns on the reverb and the echo, and he says, hey, what the heck is this? Where's all that reverb? Like, turn it off. And he says, we don't like reverb. And then the song winds up being this mashup between Here Comes the Sun and Mr. Tambourine Man. Oh my gosh. And then Jeff Lynne is accompanying him.
It's all right. Okay, it's all right.
And then this wonderful caller, she gets to ask a second question. And she asks George, what do you see when you look in the mirror? And George says in a low voice, he says, like, don't ask me. Don't ask me. I see too many things. And I guess he realizes he's got to come up with something. And he says, I see an old pirate. I see someone quite nice. And then he was probably going to say something a little bit heavy, maybe a little bit too heavy for radio. But then the DJ, like wisely interrupts and gets George off the hook and says goodbye. Thank you very much to this wonderful caller. Moves on to the next caller. And George immediately gives this next caller a bit of a hard time and doesn't even barely acknowledge him, and then launches into another tune like That's All Right, Mama.
Well, it's all right, Mama.
Probably blowing off a little bit of steam. And then he asks the guy, okay, what's your question? And then it turns out to be something that George really likes to talk about, like Devil's Radio. What is Devil's Radio? And George goes, oh my God, we all do it all the time. It's all this talk radio, what we're doing right now. He says, even I do it. Like I can say, hey, you know what I saw Paul doing last night? And he says, I do it all the time, basically. And now look at me. You can't get me off the radio right now. I'm just going on. And he starts to wax poetic after that. Maybe he's had another Dos Equis. Who knows?
Hipsters, flipsters, and finger-popping daddies, knock me your lobes. We come to Berry Caesar not to hip you to him.
Next caller gets him talking about guitars again, and he starts talking about the old Gretsch that he's been playing all night and how nice it is, even though it's an old guitar, and how most likely it's going home with him. And he says the guitars, they were a real savior for him. And how, he was nervous that evening, like right then and there, he was really nervous, but just having a guitar in his hand, it really helps.
Let's face it, this guitar is me.
I have a feeling it's now yours too, George.
Then he talks about the Beatles a little bit and how much he loves them. And then the DJ, Bob Coburn, asks him and Jeff to play them a tune. And so George and Jeff break into the Everly Brothers tune, Let It Be Me.
So never leave me lonely.
Then a caller asks George what he thinks about the old Beatles records coming out on CD. And George says, yep, sounds good. I really love it. Go out and buy them so we can get our royalties and we can all love one another and be happy. Next caller named Evelyn asks George about writing the song Something. And George remembers writing something at Abbey Road on a piano, and he's in one studio and Paul is in the studio over there, and Paul is recording in the road. Why don't we do it in the road? And George says, I really don't play the piano. I only use 3 fingers on the piano. So here I am kind of putting some chords together. And before I know it, it's like sounding amazing. It's like, where did all this come from? It's just kind of magic how that all came together. And then he starts crooning something to the caller, Evelyn, and he's using her name in the song. It's just wonderful.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and we'll meet you all again down the avenue.
That's about it for the interview. If you haven't heard it before, definitely give it a listen. And if you have heard it before, give it a few more listens because it's absolutely worth it. It's one of the most beautiful things in the entire world, basically. And I can't do it justice. I really can't. I just wanted to talk about it because, like I said, it's a beautiful thing, just like George. Thank you so much for being here with me today. I really and truly appreciate it. And until next time, peace and love one another. Take care.
Beatles is Beatles are Beatle. In the end, it's like, oh, sod off with the Beatles,